Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to your Daily Penguin. This is my tour through my Penguin Classic wall. We're going to spend all year looking at these penguins and talking about them. It struck me as only right. It struck me as a much better way to do this than just pulling down 10 at a time in a normal shelf tour. And I've been having a blast, and it's been very gratifying that a lot of you have been liking these, because I didn't know how much I would enjoy them. And we have gone all over the map here. We have been in the ancient world, we've been in the Renaissance, been in the Reformation. We've done Penguin Classic hardcovers, we've done Penguin Classic deluxe editions, we've done, you name it, all kinds of things, even science fiction editions. And a little while ago, we were in a vein of Steve A-list books, where just by random chance we were getting things that I can't live without, that are actually load-bearing columns in my own book love, the King James Bible, the Boswell's Life of Johnson, that sort of thing. And it's an example of how well a lot of you know me, that I leave my email on every video. Feel free to email me. That is not a marketing trick. That is not going to lead you to my merch store. That is not going to lead you to some terrified intern wanting to take your personal information. That's just you breaking up my day with emails on anything in the world. It doesn't have to be books. But I had a number of people email me and wonder. I've had people wondering where certain figures are that haven't appeared yet in this penguin March of the Penguins that we're doing, and also a number of people saying that how to put it, that they appreciate that I am not lecturing on the subject here. And that is true. I am not lecturing on the subject. So I give you, this is a shelf tour. It's just an extremely attenuated one. So I'm giving you my personal reactions to these things. I may call them great, some of them. But it's my personal opinions on them. And that's very different from if I were, for instance, constructing a syllabus to teach a class on the Western canon or the Eastern canon or whatever. And that was underscored yesterday. It's yesterday. I talked about Andrew Marvell, or not yesterday, I didn't make any videos yesterday, but the day before that, I talked about Andrew Marvell. He was our last Penguin Classic, and he is canonical now. The Penguin Classic volume of his complete poetry is a beautifully researched scholarly volume about him, and his times, and his provenance, and his metrics. It's just an incredibly accessible one-volume scholastic treatment of this figure, who I considered and said in the video is very minor, ought to be considered very minor. And I heard from quite a few people who didn't agree with that, who really love Marvell's poetry. And most of the people I heard from got it. Most of the people that I heard from understood where I was, to use the 1960s phrase, coming from, which was a place of this is not book criticism, this Penguin Classic tour. This is a personal library tour. I can back up a lot of what I say, but still, I only got a handful of emails about Andrew Marvell that came from the wrong place, that came from, in 3 cases, tenured academics, telling me that I had obviously misunderstood him, that I had obviously misunderstood his importance in English letters, that I et cetera, that I didn't understand what I was talking about. And I wanted to say, I will be courteous to those people and to anyone else who writes to me, but I wanted to say, okay, watch the video that I made about Andrew Marvell and ask yourself, does it sound to you like you're listening to someone who has no idea what he's talking about? What you mean is you don't agree with me. And if you said that, we'd be best buddies. But don't tell me that this author that I have read and studied longer than you've been alive is something that... Anyway, I didn't say that. I'm not going to say it now either, but... that's the sort of thing that you're going to have to, if you've been watching all of these Daily Penguins and you'll already be used to it, you're going to have to get used to the fact that this Penguin wall for me is not a status symbol. These are intensely personal books for me. I have grappled with these authors, gone back to them many times, studied them, pored over them, and so you're getting intensely personal opinions. And that brings us to today's Penguin Classic, which shouldn't exist as a Penguin Classic, but I am still going to praise it because, just like the Andrew Marvell volume, it is a masterpiece of criticism. It's a masterly work of scholarship. It's Christopher Smart. It's the selected poems of Christopher Smart, who was an acquaintance of Dr. Johnson's, and well, let's just say the back acres of his farm were overgrown. No blue M&Ms in his bag. That's one egg short of an omelet. That sort of thing. And he wrote largely religious poetry. I'm going to read you what the back of the volume says. It's preposterous, but still. He wrote largely religious poetry, and when I have heard this author overpraised for decades. He's been overpraised for centuries. And when I hear that, I have a strong suspicion that if he had written the exact same kind of poetry as he largely did, not always, I'm going to read you a poem of his, you'll see that sometimes he could hold it together. But most of this is incoherent gibberish. And if he had written incoherent gibberish about the crops or the seasons, I think he wouldn't have been allowed as much latitude. We tend to allow incoherent gibberish to gain an extra degree of front parlor respectability if it's somehow on the subject of religion. And I would think that someone like John Donne or Gerard Manley Hopkins would find that deeply insulting. I would think the religious people, just in general, would find that deeply insulting, that if you stand on a street corner on a banana box and start canting gibberish, people could think you're profound, when they don't accept gibberish as being profound anywhere else. But anyway, this is an edition by Karina Williamson and Marcus Walsh, and it's incredible. Incredible. Long, lovingly detailed introduction. Incredibly sympathetic, but no less scholarly for that. And a huge apparatus of notes. Because this was, as everybody was in Johnson's day, this is an extremely elusive writer. And he's not footnoting his own work. He's referring to the topics of the moment and then writing about them. And if you don't know that, you're going to lose a lot. You're going to lose a lot. It's like, for instance, if you were to try and read Macflecknoe, the great satirical poem Macflecknoe, if you were to try to read that without knowing what the poet is talking about, you would lose a lot. A lot. I would say almost all, except the joy of the rhythm. Which isn't so much an active concern with this particular author. Well, let me read you what this is the back cover copy, and I'm assuming that the editors approved of this, or maybe wrote it themselves, since what harried, overworked publicity agent at Penguin Classics 50 years ago would have known enough about Christopher Smart to write this. I'm assuming the editors probably had a strong hand in it. Christopher Smart, who lived from 1722 to 1771, is the most startlingly original of 18th century poets, and his life, the idyllic Kent gardens of his childhood, his early love for Anne Vane, his Grub Street intrigues, terrible years in madhouses and debtors' prisons, stamped vivid impressions on his poetry. During the years of his madness, he produced some of his finest hymns and psalms, and the cryptic and glowing poem journal Jubilate Agno, as well as the Song of David, and here the authors are writing without irony, the greatest religious poem of the century. Smart's virtually none of that is actually true. And it gets worse, because the next paragraph starts, Smart's poetry is growing in popularity. And all his best work is included in this new edition. We might as well give it to Robert Browning. Recent critics agree with Robert Browning, who perceives Smart's peculiar genius to be the way he, quote, pierced the screen twixt thing and word, lit language straight from soul. Okay. All right. That doesn't happen throughout most of the stuff that's collected in this book. It will be curious to you. It will be interesting to you. But the Jubilate Agno especially doesn't make any sense at all, even when it's annotated. Most of it doesn't. But I want to read you one of his more controlled poems, so you get a sense of what he could do when his wits were about him, which wasn't often, and when he was free to write instead of locked up, which wasn't often, and when he was addressing a normal, comprehensible subject, which wasn't often. This is hymn number 4. It's the conversion of St. Paul. The famous story, of those of you who grew up in Christian households will know it instantly, that St. Paul was Saul of Tarsus. He was a persecutor of the new sect of Christians. And on the road to Damascus, he was thrown from his horse by a blinding light, and a voice spoke out of the light saying, "Why do you persecute me?" And Saul of Tarsus became Paul, St. Paul, eventually, one of the foremost architect of formal Christianity, even though The voice does not identify itself, and he never sees anyone. It's and never saw Jesus Christ when Jesus Christ was purported to be alive. It's a very fascinating subject. I've read a huge amount on St. Paul. I think he's just endlessly interesting. But that is the conversion that we're talking about here. Just in case some of you didn't know that story, that is the conversion of St. Paul. It's done directly. It's not done through a priest or through a happy moment in a churchyard. It's Jesus knocking somebody off his horse and saying, hey, why don't you become a Christian? So that's the conversion that we're talking about here. Now I want to try and get the Smartian cadences right. Through him, the chief, begot by none, controlled the progress of the sun. The shadow, too, through him retired, the 10 degrees it had acquired. The barren could her fruit afford, the woman had her dead restored. The statesman could himself demean to seek the river and be clean. At his command, even Christ I am. The cruse was filled, the iron swam, the floods were dried to make a track, and Jordan's wave was driven back. All these in ancient days occurred, the great achievements of the word, by Joshua's hand, by Moses' rod, by virtue of the men of God. But greater is the mighty deed, to make a profligate recede, to work a boisterous madman mild, to walk with Jesus like a child, to give a heart of triple steel, the Lord's humanity to feel, and there, where pity had no place, to fill the measure of his grace. To wash internal blackness white, to call the worse than dead to light, to make the fruitless soil to hold 10,000 times 10,000-fold. To turn a servant of the times from modish and ambitious crimes, to pour down a resistless blaze. Go, persecutor, preach and praise. And what Smart is saying in that poem is actually very, very good. It's very, very good Christian thinking, which is that it's a more remarkable thing indeed. It's a more remarkable feat to turn the profligate heart than it is to part the seas. I like that. I like that sensibility very much. And that sensibility does occur in some of Smart's poetry, the sane poetry, the controlled poetry. You'll notice one of the things that I find most touching about that hymn and a bunch of other hymns that have that similar kind of feel, even when they're writing about different subjects, is the intense sympathy that they have with the lost souls, with the extremely personal, private nature of redemption, of conversion. That I think, if you knew nothing about Christopher Smart, you knew nothing about this poor tortured guy who used to fall down in fits in the street in London and didn't know where his next meal was coming from half the time. If you knew nothing about him and you still read those psalms and hymns, you would still think this was a genuinely tortured soul. This is a person who did not experience, this is a person who experienced personal travails in a way that, for instance, the narrator of the religious poetry of John Donne absolutely did not. And I find that very interesting. But it would be just as interesting if it were the 6 controlled, sane poems in a Christopher Smart section of the Oxford Book of English Verse instead of a whole Penguin Classic. Because this is for a book like this, and there's plenty more. This could have been double the size. If a book like this, a collection like this, forces the editors to bring in a lot of stuff that was written in mania. And I don't know what that does for, well, I guess he's getting more popular all the time, so it can't be hurting his reputation that much. But anyway, that's your Penguin Classic for today, and it is the same story as Andrew Marvell, only more so. Because this is an author who deserves a footnote, not a book. Unless we're going to say that all authors deserve a book, or that every author deserves a footnote. I don't know one way or another. But I don't know that you're going to find a book's worth of enjoyment in this. But I even, whether you do or not, you might. But I want to recommend it to you as a work of scholarship. There is, I know of no other comparable, accessible, comprehensive volume on this author. So as a Penguin Classic, it definitely gets a recommendation. Maybe not as an author. But then again, those are the breaks. That's what you get. Who knows what will happen tomorrow? More poetry? I don't know. Does this Marvell and Smart now? Does this mean we're in vein of poetry? I intentionally didn't look ahead, so we shall see. I'll be back tomorrow, and we'll find out then. Thank you, Book 2.